Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our Secrets of Successful Market Researchers webinar. My name is Charu Gupta. I'm the Marketing Director here at InCrowd, and I'll be moderating our panelists and your questions today. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists for today, Diane Hayes and Katie Ka. Diane has had a long career in statistics and pharmacology that has spanned many segments of the industry. Following her Ph.D. in epidemiology from the University of Illinois and positions in academia that included work with large NIH-sponsored clinical trials and extensive pharma and market research executive roles, Diane went on to co-found InCrowd with Janet Kozlov, and together they've pioneered micro-survey methodology for the life sciences industry. A little bit about InCrowd. InCrowd is a real-time market research technology platform that uses automation and advanced sampling algorithms and databases to quickly and easily reach targeted stakeholders and deliver high-quality data within hours. At InCrowd, Diane runs operations and manages the responder side of the business, our crowd of 1.8 million clinical experts. Her deep understanding of epidemiology has provided foundational expertise in the development of InCrowd's proprietary and leading-edge microsurvey platforms. Katie Ka is a career life sciences market researcher with a passion for research and insights. Katie has worked across all major therapeutic areas with an emphasis in oncology and infectious diseases. She has worked with multinational manufacturers to academia-backed startups. Katie currently leads InCrowd's research strategy and reporting teams with a focus on providing excellent client service. Katie is a science nerd at heart with a bachelor's degree in cell biology and molecular genetics, and she also has a master's degree in marketing. So today, Diane and Katie are going to speak from their deep and extensive experience in life sciences market research and what they've seen and learned from working with some of the best in this field. So with that, let me hand it over to Diane and Katie.
Thanks, Charu, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today. We're going to discuss some of the challenges we find as market researchers with many years of experience in the industry. We've worked with clients to conduct a wide range of research activities, and we've encountered many problems along the way. This has really helped us to identify some best practices. We'll start with asking the right question. I think one of the things I see happening poorly in our industry is that people really are asking the wrong question. They might be setting them up properly or phrasing them wrong. Therefore, they're not getting the information on the back end that they really need. This might be due to a very seemingly simple misplacement of a word or two, an answered choice that is misleading or even out of order, a poor choice of question type, or many other issues that we've encountered as part of the questionnaire design process. Katie, I believe you have some additional thoughts on thinking about the answers needed, about the answer that you need first.
Sure, yeah. Another way to think about it really is, what's the answer we need to get from this question? I think sometimes we focus so much on the question that we're going to ask or asking the most comprehensive question. But what happens is, in the process of that, we lose sight of the quality of the answer that we'll get. I think one of the easiest ways or common ways that I see this happen is when we forget that in an online environment, it's very easy to get distracted, especially if respondents are taking surveys on mobile devices. So when you start asking long and tedious questions like numerous repetitive attribute ratings or product allocations with 10 different drugs or regimens by 4 different patient types, and then you repeat it 2 or 3 more times throughout the survey, it's inevitable that the respondents will get tired, sometimes frustrated, or even worse, they get distracted and give up. So a few things to ask yourself when you write up an allocation question. The first is, can I streamline the number of products or regimens that I show that I need my respondents to allocate? So let's assuming I'm focusing on usage of, say, targeted therapies or immunotherapies. Do I need to show all of the various combinations of platinum doublets, or can I just create a single category that says platinum doublets, or better yet, chemo doublets, and just put it all into one bucket? The second question is, after you show your stimuli, do you really need to reallocate fully multiple times, or in some cases, is it adequate to ask for a single adjustment? The third one is, if you do need to ask multiple allocations, can you break it up so that the respondents get a couple of easy to answer questions that they can click through so they get a little bit of a mental break before going through the next set of allocation exercises? And this similar type of thinking applies for long batteries of rating questions as well. And I think also for open-ended questions especially, you really want to think hard about the types of answers that you will get, since it's completely free text and you can't really manage what they type in. So what you can do is try to manage how you ask the question, or even in some cases using short multiple answers to string together a series of short questions that they can give you responses that on the back end will ultimately be a lot more meaningful.
Yes, we've all completed those exhausting surveys with, long batteries of lists. I think we really do need to do better as researchers. Think about the information we need to gather while paying attention to how our responders will engage with the questions.
Yep, I think at the end of the day, we just need to remind ourselves that just because we think our topic or our study is really interesting, the respondents may not always share our level of interest or depth of investment. So it's our jobs to make sure that we interact with them, especially in an online environment, that we keep them engaged and that we don't make them feel bogged down. We want them to enjoy the experience of taking our survey so they're more likely to share meaningful insights with us.
So let's move to an interesting example of how a research design can determine the findings of a project. First, we're going to take a poll about designing questions to get to the information you need. We did a coupon project with a client some time ago, and they'd suggested testing one coupon amount. In the end, we recommended that they test 2 different amounts. So answer the poll that's about to come up on your screen. Which coupon amount do you think performed the best with prescribers writing scripts for product X? A $5 coupon that required $5 to purchase the product, or a $10 coupon that required $10 to purchase the product? So remember, the patient's actually paying $5 or $10 based on the coupon amount. We'll give you a couple minutes to answer the question here. Okay, let's wrap it up. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to answer. Another minute or 2 here. All right, I think we have critical mass. It looks like about 50-50. That is really so interesting. That is pretty much the same results that our client found when they asked prescribers of this question. So due to the client's urgent need for this information, we fielded this as a real-time survey with physicians to test both a $5 and $10 coupon to purchase the product. Both $5 and $10 first use priced coupons received the same positive perception from prescribers, validating that our clients could use the $10 coupon and preserve needed resources for the company. Only testing one amount could have led us down the path towards using a coupon that cost the company twice as much money and burned many needed resources. So interesting to see that we found very similar results with the group here today. So I've been in market research for a while now, but in the broader research industry for a long time. And the key to whatever position I've had has been really focused on how to ask the right question. It seems really straightforward and simple. Unfortunately, it's not. For instance, you could ask a hematologist how they might treat a particular lymphoma patient. And then you find out, well, there are many different types of lymphoma diagnoses. They have different treatment protocols, first line, second line, rescue, stage of disease and progression, etc. So there are so many different moving parts that if you're not very specifically stating the question right to begin with, you'll get some nonsensical answers that really don't apply to anything and certainly don't help address your client's needs. So I think it's very much about learning how to ask the right question, target it in the right way to the right audience. So phrasing properly requires understanding your audience. Katie, what have you experienced regarding tailoring a question to your audience?
Yeah, for sure. You need to understand your audience. I think this is especially nuanced in the healthcare sector. Let's take oncology, for example. You have solid versus hematologic tumors, and then you drill into, say, specific tumor sites. And then even when referring to a specific tumor type, you have to think about things like histology, mutations, and various biomarkers, patient comorbidities, et cetera. And those are all very relevant to how physicians think about the treatment approach. So you need to put yourself in the mindset of your respondent and how they think instead of how you think, and try to pose questions to them from their perspective and not yours. So I think on the flip side of that, the same reason that you would use specific medical terminology with physicians, you would not use that same language with patients. So for example, if you're engaging with a physician, you might refer to febrile neutropenia, but if you're talking to a patient, you're probably better off just referring to it as fever. And I think many of us spend more time engaging with healthcare professionals than patients. So sometimes it's actually less intuitive to not use medical jargon when writing a survey for patients. And I think this is very important to keep in mind when you think about the general population of patients, and that the national average for reading comprehension is between the 7th and 8th grade level. There was actually recently an article published in Quarks magazine by the PMRG Health Literacy Initiative Committee about the impact of low health literacy on market research. And in that article, there are some good suggestions for good practices. It's always important to remember that you want the respondent to understand what you're asking them. That includes the terminology that you use and how you phrase up the question. Especially in an online environment, you don't have the luxury of being able to answer any questions for them or clarify the intent of your question. So things like pre-tests and qualitative research can be a good way to flesh out some of these things, especially if it's a newer treatment area for your team. Okay, and so here's another example. This is a question that I hear regularly from clients. They often want to know, which patient types will doctors prioritize for my drug? And this is a very important and valid question for clients to be asking. And I think for us as researchers designing the surveys and engaging with doctors, we need to remember that doctors don't prioritize patients for treatments. They don't look at their armamentarium of drugs and say, oh, well, which patient type can I try out on this new drug? They don't think that way. It's sort of flipping it around. They prioritize treatments for patients. They'll evaluate the patient and choose the best option that they have for that patient. So ultimately, in your research, you can absolutely figure out which patient types are more likely to get your drug, but you don't ask the doctor the question, which patient types will you prioritize for this brand? It doesn't resonate with them. I mean, they can give you an answer, but it will turn them off and can be frustrating. It's just not really how they think.
Yes, such a simple rephrase results in vastly different results sometimes. I do think we need to pay more attention to how we ask questions to our responders and take better care of them. It may be the last thing we consider when we rush to get a survey fielded so we get the data that we desperately need. However, if we alienate our responders, we have more and more difficulty gathering the data needed for the next project that we have on our minds. So let's talk a little bit about the stakeholder. Why do they care? Do we even know? Have we asked? Katie, I know this is something you're really passionate about. How do you manage the stakeholder in the market research effort?
Yes, I think this is probably one of the most important behaviors to adopt as a market researcher, and it's actually stepping outside of the market research sort of data-driven mindset and taking a step back to assess the bigger picture and making sure that you have a lay of the land. Make sure you know what it is that your stakeholder needs to learn and why they care. Having that information will always put you in a better position to deliver the answers that they ultimately need. Sometimes that will include asking questions that they hadn't even thought of, but you were able to uncover those needs by finding out why they care and what they plan to do with that information. So here's a scenario, right? You get a list of questions from your stakeholder or client who needs an answer right away. And you move quickly towards how do we answer these questions, and you start thinking about methodology and ways to write up the questions. Before you go down that path, just pause for a minute and ask yourself a couple of questions. The first is, what are the actual objectives that I need to address with the questions that I'm going to ask? And secondly, and this is more important, is why does my stakeholder care? So this may seem very straightforward, but in reality, the information is not always obvious to the person that's writing the survey. You have to remember that clients and internal stakeholders are often very busy, and they don't always take the time to discuss why they care about the information or what the marketing team is planning to do with that information. And I think especially in a real-time environment, clients often skip right to, here are the questions that I need, and we'll pause and we stop and we ask for some background and why they care. And when I do that, I find that one of two things typically happen. The first is they take a deep breath, download everything they can in 30 seconds, and sometimes will even comment that it felt very therapeutic for them to just have a chance to process everything and verbalize it all at once. And we're good to go. We're good to go, move forward with the survey. I think the other thing that happens as we engage in this dialogue is that we start to talk about the business issues, our clients start to talk about the information they know, and then we realize that there are some important considerations that they haven't discussed with their stakeholder. So as a result, through this process, we're able to help our clients think more thoroughly and design a better survey that may look quite different from the original set of questions.
Well, when doing real-time research and time is of the essence, this really can be an issue. We compress every step, which places quite a burden on our team to be efficient and quick. One of the things that we stress is to take some time at this point in the process. Think about the objectives and why your client cares. For those who come from a more traditional setting, you'll also want to identify this before spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and maybe many months of your life that you'll never get back. Before you set up to deploy your beautiful, fantastic global forecast with all the bells and whistles, you might want to actually sit down with your marketing team, think through the issue, and learn that what you actually need is to do a segmentation.
So as Charu said, I'm a huge science nerd at heart, and I think part of what led me down the path of pursuing market research is the realization that the scientific method really does apply. So we start out with thinking about, observation. We identify the problem. What is the problem that your client or stakeholder needs to solve for? What are the issues here? And from there, you generate your research objectives, which really are tied to the specific hypotheses that you've generated. And then the third step is testing, designing your research and executing, etc.
So the old saying, everything we need to know we learned in kindergarten, might be true here, right? Maybe not kindergarten, but we probably did learn this in grade school. And I do think it certainly applies to many of us as market researchers.
Yep. So in summary, the next time that an internal stakeholder or client approaches you with a list of questions they need answers to, just take a minute and ask, why do we care about this information? What will we do with it? Is it purely informational, or will a decision be made based on the findings? Another example is thinking about concept or message testing. Just understanding, is this an exploratory first step in many rounds of testing, or is this sort of at the end of that path and it's just a final confirmatory disaster check before proceeding with the final decision?
So I think at the other side of what we've been discussing is data analysis. It's important when you begin interpreting your results to know there's possibility for error and really understand what the data is telling you. There are many opportunities for bias when conducting research, and ways to address the potential of bias is really a key step in the research process. It might be from the point of respondent selection, where you use a sampling algorithm, to randomizing responses, to proper framing of the question, or the proper analytic plan. There are just so many different ways to address bias, and certainly paying attention with survey design, survey execution, and analysis is critical. Katie, let's turn our attention to some of the best practices when reviewing data and drawing conclusions.
Sure. An obvious example is when we collect allocations. So we start out by asking physicians to allocate what percent of patients they currently treat with drugs A, B, C, etc. And then we show a new product description, and then we have them reallocate the percent of patients that they would treat with products A, B, C, the existing ones, as well as the new product. For this type of exercise, we always have to be very clear that the output here is not intended for forecasting input. The number that you get in this question type really is a measure of the potential magnitude of physicians' interest in or appetite for your product. Because when you look at the results and it says they're going to treat 38% of patients with this product, we all know that that's not going to be the actual share among treated patients. So at the end of the day, market research is really based on respondents' self-reported behaviors, attitudes, perceptions, and anticipated changes in behavior. In reality, we know there are so many other factors, especially in healthcare, that will influence the ultimate usage of a product. When you analyze your data, I advise that it's really important to find consistent and meaningful patterns than to try and force precision into stated intentions.
So I think in terms of being open-minded and realizing that sometimes you get an answer to a question, it's going to lead you down a path of asking another question. You need to keep your mind open to the fact that there are things that you don't know and you didn't know that you didn't know. And realizing that, oh, well, this data point tells me something and it makes me wonder about something else. It's really important to be open to taking the next step, asking the next question, and continuing down that path of understanding. I think this iterative process makes so much sense today. In our personal lives, we're very used to having information at our fingertips to make decisions. We don't get hung up on not having the information. We go and get it, and we move on to the next step. It all happens in a really iterative fashion, building on the last thing that we learned. I think in our industry, we found that microsurvey technology is really particularly suited for this process. It's very easy to pop off a quick, simple survey because you learned something from the last work that you did, and just sort of continue on that really iterative process. So let's think about how often this happens in your day-to-day work. There's a poll that will pop up on your screen. How often do you or your team have follow-up questions after seeing the results of a completed project? So take a minute or two here and answer this question. It looks like only 2 of the options popped up, most of the time or some of the time. So we might have a technical glitch on our side. I promise we weren't trying to spike the answers. So why don't you use most of the time if it does happen to you regularly, and some of the time if it does not happen to you much at all. My apologies for that. We love technology. It's our friend, and however, sometimes it eludes us. So most of the time on your answer option is that it happens pretty regularly, and some of the time is that it happens very irregularly. We're going to be creative and problem solve here.
Oh, actually, it showed up.
Actually, that's interesting. On the screen, it only showed the 2 options, but here we go. All 4 of them are listed, so that's great. I didn't have to be creative after all. So it's obvious as the poll results have come in that this is a fairly common experience that people have, that you'll learn something, and your market research project, as we've come to think of research in our field, doesn't necessarily always have the final answer for you. You learn things, you need to know more things. And, in the old days, we would have to wait until the next market research project loaded up and, add your questions to that. and send it off to get the next round of answers. I think in today's world, with our lovely technology, we have much more flexibility in being creative, problem solving, and being iterative, and asking these questions very quickly and not having to wait for the next project to field. So thanks for your patience with that one. Interesting results. I think this be ready to problem solve is just really good life advice. It's particularly true in our industry. Issues come up, you have to find another path and solve the problem. I think it does require experience and know-how to be a really good problem solver, and being able to draw on your history is just invaluable. So pay attention to what works and what doesn't, and find creative ways to apply a solution that maybe worked in a different setting to the problem that you're encountering now. Katie, how does this present for you in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, so I recall early in my career, a very dynamic colleague once looked up from her computer and announced to those of us in the room, she said, you know, I should just officially change my title to professional problem solver. So I think it's just something that, you know, we encounter as part of our day-to-day. But, you know, in all seriousness, though, I can certainly share an example of how of problem solving based on how we screen respondents. We recently started working in a relatively new disease area with patients, and due to the nature of the condition and the patient types that we were looking for, we realized that many of them may not even think of themselves as having this particular disorder. So while the official diagnosis, or how a physician, right, engaging with physicians, how they would categorize these patients has a specific terminology associated, it's likely that the patients don't label themselves that way. And so we learned that after we launched the initial screener and we saw there was a high screen out rate, we took a look and we revised the question, removed the name, the sort of official medical name of the disorder, and instead we asked a couple of questions that were much more specific to their behaviors. And these questions were set up in a much more patient-friendly way, using less medical terms so that the average patient could relate to it. And this certainly helped our screen rate a bit.
So Katie's point about being able to troubleshoot and be thoughtful are important. I understand the client or the project well enough that I can really be engaged with the solution to meet their needs. I think that might be the biggest secret of all, right? Having the kind of personality that allows you to stay flexible and engaged and helpful from the start to the finish of the project is really what's so critical.
So, I think the last point that we want to make here is just stay curious, and that's pretty simple. Just keep an open mind. Remember that the world is not static, and that with new scientific discoveries and technology advancements and even changes in policy means that the world we know today will evolve and look very different in the future. For example, we can think about how payers managed access and reimbursement for specialty drugs 5 years ago. Looks very different from today and will likely look different in 3 years when we look back. So there's always more that you can learn about a space that you're working in, and just remember to be open to learning something new. And if you find yourself in a situation where you don't know exactly how to approach a problem, that's okay. Take a step back, look at the situation, figure out what you do know, draw from your relevant past experiences, and ultimately, at the end, you can reach out and ask for help.
It's interesting because I think many of us researchers or statisticians were kind of, black and white in some regards. We think a little rigidly at times. We have an algorithm, we have a plan, we have an approach, we use the scientific method. We're very kind of calculated in that way. And I think that's the thing that we're trying to turn on its head a little bit here. You're really going to have to rely on other people. You have to either rely on your vendors or your experience, perhaps somebody in your organization who has complementary experience, maybe a mentor or a colleague who can provide thoughtful direction. But I think the truth is, to bring your kid out a little bit, stay thoughtful, stay curious, and have a burning desire to learn. This will drive you to ask questions in a way to get answers that you most need. Well, that actually wraps up the content for today's session. So why don't we open the floor to questions?
Yes. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Diane, for a very informative presentation. So let's turn to Q&A. If there are questions for Diane or Katie or anything that you just heard or saw in the presentation, please use the questions feature in the GoToWebinar dashboard to submit those questions, and we'll bring them up to Diane and Katie. So I see several of you have already started submitting some questions throughout the presentation. So let me start with this one. So we have a question from the audience about advice. So what advice would you have for younger market researchers who don't have as much broad or varied experience as yet?
So since I'm the elder here, I'll take that question. I do think experience makes a huge difference, and sort of paying attention to what you learn along the way is just invaluable. But we all start somewhere, and we all have to learn the ropes. So I think having a mentor, having a colleague who's willing to mentor you and provide suggestions and advice is just really helpful. I think being willing to, go to the web and find information and get some starting points is also really helpful. But in this industry, I think it's really important to get a gut check. Somebody who's in the industry, who understands compliance considerations and regulations, that drive all of our lives. So I think it's really important to just sort of double test what you're learning and kind of have a gut check with somebody who's a colleague, a mentor, a friend, somebody who you can spend some time talking with.
Great. Along those lines of being young researchers, we have another question. What are some of the best tools to analyze the data for younger researchers?
Well, let me just start the answer, because I think to dovetail off of what I just said, I do think that younger researchers bring so much creativity to the field. They're not locked in maybe where my generation is locked in. They're just way more open and interested, and this question is a really good example of that. What other tools are out there? What can I use? How can I learn things by looking at different approaches to the problem? So I think we have a lot of different tools that we use and that we offer through InCrowd, but I think there are many different ways to collect information. You have some thoughts on that too, Katie?
Yeah, I think as far as analytical tools out there, the traditional ones that people think of might be something like SPSS, which is a large piece of software. I think there have been some nice developments and improvements in terms of user experience and just easier to use software. One that I have historically had good experiences with is called Q. So it's funny because most people say, you mean R? And I say, no, I mean Q. Because I know R is a free software that's available that a lot of people in college use, and they learn analysis using R. But there's, one of the tools that we like to use is Q. It's designed by consultants who wanted a much easier interface for people who are not hardcore statisticians, and they wanted it to be robust enough that it can be very productive in a business setting. So that's one that I can think of.
I also think there's some interesting tools that are doing a lot of different things, like geofencing and some of the qualitative work. There's a fun tool that has taken people's expression and has sort of cataloged them, millions and millions of expressions, so that you can say, well, if you make this face, you're happy. If you make this face, you're sad. And there are a number of different emotions that come along with that. The website's called Affectiva, but there are a lot of different places that are offering something that's kind of similar, that measures emotion without it being self-report. So I think that's a really interesting avenue in our industry, and a tool that I think we're going to see a lot more uptake of.
Yeah, and to continue on that, one of the kind of up and coming, I guess, startups really that we've seen is similar to what Di was describing. What they do is they offer a platform where people can take videos of themselves answering a question. And I think they are actually partnering with Affectiva on some of the facial analysis. But these are all different tools that are kind of being rolled out to to buyers, whether as a standalone or in partnership with another larger agency that they can incorporate into a survey. So respondent could be going through and answering your typical online survey with multiple choice questions, and then they'll get a question where they press a record button and it records their answer in the form of a video, and that gets analyzed on the back end.
So that's so interesting, because my niece just is taking a PE course online. Let that sink in for a second. A phys ed course online, but that's exactly how they're doing it.
Yeah.
You have to take videos of yourself doing certain things. And, some of them need to show progress. And some of them just need to show that you're spending the time doing the exercise. So I think it's one of those situations where things that are happening in the consumer space certainly are trickling into our space. And we're really beginning to have some very interesting technologies that we can use in our industry to do the work that we've done, maybe in a very, very similar fashion for a long time.
Great. Shifting gears a little bit to some of the stakeholder discussion that you had, questions coming in around that a little bit. So the why questions that you spoke to, the question is around those why questions. What other approaches do you recommend for really understanding what stakeholders want, especially how to make them slow down and make them realize that while as a market researcher, I can get them data quickly, that will not be helpful if the data doesn't answer the right question.
So, what's the question?
The question
how
is,
do we get them to slow down?
Yeah, how, I think, if I interpret this question, I think what they're asking is, how can, what are approaches sort of from a team approach, sort of a relational approach? How can we as market researchers, convince our stakeholders to slow down and think about these why questions?
I think that's really interesting, because it does seem that having a relationship with the client is really important. If they trust you, if they understand why you're slowing them down, if you can, say, remember this project that we did that, we got really dynamite answers to because we really took this upfront time to, to sort of hash out why we're doing this and what we need. That's what we need to do here.
Yeah. And I think another way to perhaps manage this process is what we were describing earlier as the iterative process. So maybe there's kind of a bigger issue that we're trying to address, and there might be pieces of it where there's one piece where we're pretty sure we know what we need to do, and we start there, but we don't have to start from the beginning to solve the entire big question. If it's a matter of, well, there's more of what we don't know, and we want to make sure we're covered in that area before we execute the entire project. So there might be situations where you have the opportunity to chop up the research into a couple, 2 or 3 smaller pieces, and do it iteratively so that you can build upon what you learn. And with the technologies that are available, that doesn't necessarily have to slow down your overall project timeline. You can be sort of responsive and quick in terms of executing the pieces that you're confident to move forward with.
It's interesting. I think we have had clients who have used the InCrowd platform to even figure out what the closed-ended responses should be to a question. It's a big, hairy question, and there are lots of responses kind of all over the board. So let's find out what that range is. Let's get some open-ended responses to a question, perhaps. And then from that, we can sort of dive into the responses in such a way that we can close them up and have a really efficient question that addresses the need very directly. So I think tying into the iterative idea, I think that's really important. But, I think reading into the sentiment of that question, it's a hard thing to do. And people are really busy in this industry, and sometimes it's just very hard to get them to slow down. And I think you'll find that sometimes you just throw your hands up in the air and say, all right, let's do it. And I think the more you do that with poor outcomes, the better you get at finessing the situation. Maybe not a great answer to somebody who's just starting out, but I think that's sort of the reality of where you stand. Clients have a lot of, they have a little time, and they like to use it really in their best interest. And sometimes it's hard to convince them that this is that.
I have a follow-up question based on this. Clearly was one of the most important parts of your presentation today. Would it be helpful to understand, help people understand what the consequences would be of not taking that step back in terms of the data? I mean, you're not answering the right question, but what are sort of the stakes, involved of not taking that step?
I think it definitely helps us on the vendor side, because if we don't understand the stakes, if we don't understand if this is something that's exploratory or confirmatory, for example, we could go down the path with you in a way that doesn't arrive at the right solution. So I think from our perspective, really getting into the heads of our clients and stakeholders and understanding why they're doing this work in the first place just really sort of helps us to be better navigators of the process.
Okay, great. I think we just have one more question. What are your secrets regarding forecasting-focused market research?
So I'm chuckling because in a past life did a lot of forecasting work, and I think one of the interesting things that I've learned along the way, we can call it a secret, we can call it a reality, we can call it a wisdom that comes with experience, is that really the key is to understand ultimately that in many cases the output of a forecasting study is less about the actual number that you hand over and more about informing the forecast and helping your client convey to their team and their forecasters or marketers, etc., the key factors that are ultimately going to have the most influence on their ability to meet their goals. So things like, what are the competitive pressures, payer management, sales marketing resources, and any of the key levers that need to be pulled in order for them to meet their goals. So I think ultimately it's helping them assess how aggressive their forecast is and what type of resources they need to put behind it to achieve those goals, and what are some of the biggest watch-outs to look for where it may be a formidable barrier to achieving their goals. So sort of all the elements that surround a forecast that really ultimately provide so much value. And I know there's so much focus on getting the right number that goes into the ultimate forecast, but I think there's a lot of steps that happen along the way that are very valuable.
I think that's a good reminder for those of us who are those accounting statistician types, that it's really not always just about an absolute number. It's about the variables involved, the pressures, the competitive landscape, etc. So I think that's important to keep in mind, whether it's a forecasting study or something else.
Okay, great. And we do have one more question that sneaked in. So what are some of the ways a healthcare management student can start preparing for a career in pharmaceutical market research?
I think one of the common ways that I see, and honestly how I got into the industry, is through an internship. That is a very low risk way to spend a few months getting to know one side of the business, whether it's a manufacturer or a vendor side, and that will give you an inside perspective to the day-to-day, and you can kind of assess through experience. I mean, I think that's a good thing to think about.
I also think, well, I'm an epidemiologist, so I'll be a little biased here, but I think taking courses like, public health health courses, epidemiology courses, statistics, and hard science classes. I mean, I think that gives you the solid background that you need. And I think there's like a great sports analogy, right? It's always back to the basics. You know, if you're a basketball player, know how to dribble, shoot, and play defense, whatever it is. So there are basics that you have to just be really good at, and the nuances you pick up along the way. So I think if you're a student, you know, embarking in a career here, get your basics down, you know, be solid in statistics, understand the industry, and get your basic science down. And I think it'll prepare you well for a career.
Great. Well, thank you again, Diane and Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We post all these videos onto our YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll find a lot of other great tips and best practices that we've made video recordings around. And you can also subscribe for our email news alerts. We often send out news and trends and tips on life sciences market research. If you have any other questions or comments that you didn't get a chance to bring up today, please feel free to email Diane, Katie, or me and let us know how we can help. And again, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today.